Thank you, Reverend John. I really appreciate it. It's a great honor to be invited to Everyday Buddhist and amazing program, Everyday Buddhist. I want to thank Reverend Turner again for the invitation. I'm very humbled and honored to be invited. And I want to thank Everyday Buddhist, all of the people working on this wonderful program that you have that's known nationwide. I want to thank Reverend Wondra, Reverend Crane, and everybody at OCBC. I love OCBC. We did a yoga seminar there, yoga and Buddhism thing, and I really appreciate Reverend Turner inviting me and everybody at OCBC um, to that great temple. I do want to mention and acknowledge that Reverend John Turner, OCBC, and Reverend Turner's wife, Linda, they are the pioneers of introducing yoga and Buddhism to the temples. And so I really appreciated their pioneering efforts in introducing that to the BCA temples. And if you're in Huntington Beach, stop by Linda's yoga studio, Sunrise Dog Yoga, and a plug for Linda, friend of mine. And thanks again to all of you for joining us today. Now, I told Reverend John I will speak for like 20 minutes. And yoga, as you know, is like Buddhism. It's a rabbit hole of so many different subjects and different discussion points and everything like that. So I just really wanted to focus on four major points here today, starting with what the definition of yoga is in India historically. And nothing better defines what the definition of yoga is. We just had June 21st was the International Day of Yoga Festival around the world. And it was really initiated by the government of India to promote traditional Indian yoga to the world. And the theme of this year's festival was One World, One Health. Well, that summarizes it really brilliantly what the definition of yoga is traditionally in India, because predating any religion, yoga was about merging what they say the Atman with the Para Atman, which means merging our individual soul or consciousness with the supreme universal consciousness. So it's this notion of thinking outside of ourselves and merging ourselves with everything in the universe. And that's very similar. I mean, it's the same concept we have in Buddhism. By the way, I am a member of the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, and also formerly from Palo Alto Buddhist Temple as well. So that really is the definition of what yoga is. It's like, it's not about us, it's about everything in this world as one. So what's the theme? One world and one health. That catchphrase for this International Yoga Festival says it all, because they're promoting everybody is one world, right? It's not about just our country or your country or this, it's everybody together. And what I think is great is one health. So they're not saying my health, they're saying one health. And it's not talking about just our individual physical health. They're talking about the health of the planet. They're talking about the environment. They're talking about all sentient beings. They're talking about trees. They're talking about, everything around the world. We should be concerned with One Health. So that really sums up the meaning of what yoga is. And it really also encapsulates the notion of interdependency and interconnectedness that we look at in Buddhism as well. So this is what the definition of yoga is. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was that yoga is not a religion. It's an umbrella of spiritual practices that all of these other religions are under. So, as many of you know, Shakyamuni Buddha practiced yoga for many years. He was Hindu. And the roots of Buddhism, of a lot of the religions, are based in Hinduism. And so Shakyamuni Buddha practiced yoga for many years. And the thing was, he practiced the techniques as a means for him to find his path to enlightenment. So it's not like he lived in a vacuum and all of a sudden decided, I'm going to sit under a tree. He had to really practice softening his body through yoga techniques. He had to practice breathing techniques. He had to practice concentration techniques in order to get to the point where he could reach meditation. So that is the foundation of, Buddhism. If we didn't have, see, a lot of the Hindus in India say if the Buddha hadn't practiced yoga, he wouldn't have led to the path of enlightenment. And actually, many Hindus say that he actually didn't discover Buddhism, but he was actually a Hindu reformist, because through his way he looked at life, he was against this whole thing of the Brahmin class controlling, being the gatekeepers of the knowledge. He thought it should be for everybody. He was against the caste system. He was against the way that women were treated. So the thing was, but if you look at, I highly recommend you read a lot of the Hindu texts. If you read the Bhagavad Gita and a lot of these texts, it's so, it'll help elevate your interest in Buddhism and belief in the Buddhist our belief system, because it's very closely related. That's why Hindus and Buddhists, they're very closely aligned in India. All the Hindus I talked to in India, they claim the Buddha as one of their own. They're so proud of the Buddha, and they don't see him as separate from them, So this is this whole idea of the interconnectedness of Buddhism and yoga. And the thing about yoga being the umbrella for all of our practices is that it's not just a practice for Hindus or Buddhists, but actually in the 16th century, Christian missionaries came over to India, and some of them went to ashrams, and they were there to convert the Indian people into Christianity. But then they started seeing the yoga practices and started doing it. And then they realized, wow, they could really learn something here. And they went back to Europe and they were asked, how many people did you convert to Christianity? And they said, none, but check out what I learned there. I learned this yoga. And they said, we didn't send you to India to learn yoga. And he says, no. They said, no. Thanks to this practice of softening the body, learning to breathe, learning to concentrate, learning to meditate, says we are now closer to God. So that is the whole genius of the practice as systematized by Maharishi Patanjali. I think many of you have heard of the Yoga Sutras. But if you look at Ashtanga Yoga, which means really the 8 limbs of yoga, and if you look at the Eightfold Noble Path, they're very, they're in tune with each other. There's a lot of debate of who came first, Patanjali or Shakyamuni Buddha. There's all this debate, but the point is nobody really knows. But both of their ways of looking at life are equally helpful to all of us, And one of the things when you look at the Eightfold Noble Path, they talk, if you look at it, the first 7 things that Shakyamuni Buddha lays out, he talks about moral and ethical things, right view, right thought, right, all of the right thing. And then at the very end, he goes, right meditation. So a lot of the people in India said, okay, we agree with all of the first 7, but how do you get to right meditation? And so Patanjali, his 8 limbs is the instruction how to get to right meditation, which Shakyamuni Buddha actually followed. And that is, besides the moral and ethical ways that you live, you use asanas or the poses that we do in yoga to soften your body so you can soften your body and sit for a long time in meditation. And then from there, you're able to practice pranayama or breathing techniques to slowly start calming the mind and concentrate. And concentration can be everything from focusing on an image. It could be the Om sign. It could be staring at the Onaijin at your temple. It could be concentrating on your breathing, the sound, anything. And then finally, you get to the point where it's your mind is no longer affected by external things flooding your mind, and then you're able to now concentrate on meditation. And then so that's the steps. So that's why if you look at yoga sutras and the Eightfold Noble Path, you could combine them. And so now you're able to have a clear mind, a concentrated mind, where now you can go to the temple and listen to the Dharma, right? So that's really, or you could listen to the Dharma, you could listen to the teachings of Allah, you could listen to the teachings of God or Jesus Christ or whatever your spiritual path is. So this is just ways that you can learn to think outside of yourself, really. And to think outside of yourself, you're able to then connect better with this universal oneness of one world and one health, right? So I think that really is one of the main benefits of yoga and Buddhism. And it could be any religion or practice. What's interesting is that even in the Buddha's time and Patanjali's time, people practice doing these movement and breathing and meditation practices. And some people were able to attain superhuman feats like levitation, different things that superhuman strength or this or that. And long time ago, back at that time, there were 2 schools of thought. So some people wanted to practice yoga so they could levitate or have superhuman strength or be able to do things that the average person couldn't do. And then there was more of the traditional path that said, no, concentrating on wanting to levitate or do these superhuman feats through yoga is defeating the purpose of focusing on universal oneness. You're just focusing on yourself to say, hey, look at me, I can levitate, you know. But so even back then, there was this kind of a difference in opinion. And if you look at yoga today, some people do yoga so they can impress people with doing fancy poses or, you know, looking good or whatever. You know, I mean, to me, it's up to the individual. If you want to, you know, go on Instagram and have your leg behind your head and do all that kind of stuff, that's you know, more power to you. That's fine. But I'm just talking about traditional Indian yoga. It's no focusing on merging our individual soul or consciousness with the universal. This idea of universal oneness and universal one health, the whole planet and everything. It's time flies. I know. The last point I wanted to cover here is that a lot of people have this view that people who study yoga or practice yoga or Buddhism are passive, that they don't do anything with society, you know. And again, back thousands of years ago, really the yogis and the Buddhists said, hey, no, don't live in a cave, go out there and engage in society. And so even today, yoga and Buddhism or Buddhists are engaged actively in society and not passively doing nothing. I mean, even Shakyamuni Buddha, he was in his time, he was an activist. He went against the status quo of how spirituality was taught, right? He did something completely different from the norm there. And that was social activism for him. If you look through history, in India, Swami Aurobindo, who was against British colonialism, he was active in writing in the press against British colonialism and against an independent India and all this stuff. He was put in prison for a year for his views. And I was actually honored to visit his place in Chennai, Pondicherry, sorry. And so he was active, even for Buddhists, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, how he's been active in trying to maintain the integrity of the Tibetan Buddhist system. I know he's facing a lot of pressure from China on how they are going to find his successor, but he's been very active in his efforts to maintain Tibetan culture and the religious succession there. And well, of course, there's Gandhi. He's another one. So these are all nonviolent activists. And then the Japanese Buddhist Yamaoka Tesshu, who was considered the greatest, last greatest swordsman of Japan, who was completely nonviolent. He never hurt anybody. He never killed anybody. He was a strong, devout Buddhist, but he went against a lot of the feudalism and brought up a lot of the working people into different work in different parts of society. So Buddhists and yogis, you know, I hope to this day will continue to engage in actively working in society And when we see people that are being harmed by ICE, by the immigration situation in this country, how people are being treated, what's happening with people's constitutional rights, all of these things. I mean, history just repeats itself over and over and over, so that it's important for yogis and Buddhists to be involved in nonviolent resistance and speaking their mind for the good of one world and one health. And for me, along with that, I'm also a proud union member. So I guess I would like to add the final line being, the injury to one is an injury to all, which is a union slogan. And that's hopefully how all of us as Buddhists and yoga practitioners will view the world and actively be involved in helping to rectify a lot of these negative things in our society, especially these days. So with that, I use my allotted time, and I just wanted to thank you all for your attention and for listening today to this very brief talking about yoga and Buddhism. And also too, you're welcome to join all of my yoga workshops, and classes are free. So if you'd like to join on Zoom, I invite you to join, and then maybe I'll put my website on the chat there. Then you could email me, look at my schedule, and join one of my Zoom classes throughout the week. And if you have any questions, you could always email me too. But with that, I thank all of you. Thank you, Sensei Reverend John, for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for listening today.